And let me start by congratulating you and IGD for this tremendous work that you're committed to doing. I think it's extremely exciting for all of us that you push these agendas forward and that kind of commitment exists. Excuse me. You started, and you started in terms of the vision for IDG with this broad issue of world poverty. And I think that it's worth starting with the thought that we may, as we speak, be failing for the first time in a dimension that we haven't thought that we have been failing for quite a long time. We've always been very careful about making claims, but the story today, as we all know, really is very, very troubling. Even before the crisis, we had a situation where the achievements that we had were very, very uneven. After all, the situation in South Asia was one where the incidence of absolute poverty might have gone down. It did go down substantially, but the actual numbers remain more or less static. And in sub-Saharan Africa, the incidence has remained more or less the same, but the absolute numbers over the last 25 years have gone up from something like 200 to close to 400 million. Those are not figures that I think that we can be proud of, to put it mildly. Now, when you add on to this the crisis, I think it remains still a little bit too early to see literally the devastating effects that this is going to have. But if we look at the indicators right now, and you referred to the issue of food prices and existing numbers, we know that for every 1% of loss of growth, there's a calculation of about 5 million extra going into poverty. But we know the story with net private capital flows. Extraordinary story, from close to $1 trillion in 2007 to a projection of something around 150 billion this year. Those are extraordinary numbers. And we have a situation where trade, for the first time in 25 years, volume-wise, is projected to actually be decreasing this year. Remittances, we know, are going to be hard hit. A lot of remittances are earned in the construction sector, which is likely, obviously, therefore not to be escaping from this. And then, of course, the great bulk of the countries that we're talking about, the great bulk of the poorest countries with the poorest people, they don't have the fiscal space to engage in stimulus. Stimulus is something that happens in these countries. They were hoping that they would continue to enjoy certain flows of official development assistance and other types of assistance, which become extremely important at this time. But there's a lot of concern as we see countries beginning to get very shaky on official development assistance flows going into the future. So the irony of it is that at a time when here in the US, everybody is talking, well, not everybody, but a lot of people are talking about the need for government to stand in and to push on the stimulus and push spending because of the particular situation that we're in. We have a situation in many parts of the world where actually the poor are going to be dependent on the private sector in a way that maybe they have always been, but has never been recognized before. Because the private sector does hold the key. It's the only thing that it's the only viable option that one can see when one looks at the fate of the poorest in this accumulating crisis. Now, it's always been the case, at least for a while now, that the private sector is fundamental. It's fundamental to the fate of the poor, firstly because of the sheer size, obviously, of the private sector. Domestic capital investment is always been much higher than public investment or foreign direct investment, despite what one might imagine from the literature. But maybe going a little bit deeper, in many respects, the poor live in the private sector in a way that we don't seem to want to recognize. For example, if you take health expenditures, the poor basically about 60% of expenditures in the poorest countries are in the private sector, compared to about 30% in OECD, DAC, rich countries. Whatever we might think ideologically about the merits or demerits of different types of expenditures or different types of coverages, the facts on the ground are that for many in the poorest countries, the poor actually rely on the private sector for health, for education, and for many other things. And then finally, it is also the fate of the poorest in many cases to actually pay more for the same goods and services than richer people do, because of lack of access, distortions in markets, and the so-called poverty penalty, which C.K. Prahalad and others have talked about and written about at some length. Given those kinds of realities, we felt that it was extremely important to engage and to push the envelope a little bit on this issue of the fundamental importance of what happens to core business. What happens to the interest and ability of core business to reach out and engage the poor and have the poor participate. Corporate social responsibility is a wonderful thing. I'm not here in any way to say anything other than that. It's of great value, and we treasure it. But the only thing that takes you to scale and that has the replicability to really have an impact on these huge global, on the kind of huge global scale that we're looking for, is the ability of core businesses to align and to adjust and to redesign in a way that they reach out and bring the poor in, both as producers and consumers, as a fundamental part of the core business strategy, with no mincing of words and no hesitation about the fact that it's part of core business. And I think one has to be clear about that. Now, it could be, and we'll come to that, it could well be that in many cases, the startup of that involves certain types of subsidies, certain types of shared costs or whatever. One shouldn't, it's not a question of trying to be purist about it, but the vision is one where core business is investing and is participating because they see it as a fundamental part of the core business strategy.